Hey there, so my name is Abigail Ozan, and this is my key findings on my research paper. For my research paper, I chose the topic intercultural marriage, and I decided to look at it from a biblical standpoint. What does the Bible say about intercultural marriages, or does it? So, my thesis for this paper is that intercultural marriage, when done properly, is not only biblically acceptable, but can also offer major benefits within the covenant in regard to personal growth. So, the four main points that I chose to focus on for this paper are number one, differences of intercultural and interracial marriages and relationships. Number two is intercultural marriage biblical? What does the Bible have to say about it, or does it? And number three, possible conflicts of intercultural marriages and relationships. And lastly, number four, positive results of intercultural relationships. So number one, what are the differences between intercultural and interracial? I feel like a lot of times we get these mixed up and we kind of just combine them and one word kind of means the other in our minds, but it's really important to note the difference. So cultural identity is not anchored in ethnic or national social structures, but rather in symbolic or imagined communities in which individuals cling as they are created and remade as social actors. So a lot of things can come into play when you're looking at cultural identity, and it's not just the color of our skin. For example, you can have I have a friend who is Chinese. She grew up in a white household and she has none of the cultural values or history of someone who has grown up in China or in a Chinese home. That's cultural identity versus racial identity. Her racial identity doesn't change, but her cultural identity is not the same as the country where she is originally from. So, in recent studies, many intercultural couples agree that economic background has a much greater impact than racial background. This is really important to go into when you're looking at intercultural versus interracial. Cultural is, again, kind of the makeup of a person, whereas a race is literally just skin color. Now, we can have a lot of different types of culture within one skin color, which is common. But it's really important to remember that skin color and culture do not necessarily coincide. So, is intercultural marriage biblical? If you grew up in a small town like I did, you have probably heard that God does not like intercultural marriages. Unfortunately, this is literally just so taken out of context, I'm not even sure where they get it. But this is kind of goes into play with the intercultural versus interracial, whereas there's a lot of racism in the smaller town where I grew up in, and they kind of used God forbidding intercultural marriages to merit their not wanting crossed racial marriages. So if you look at Deuteronomy 7:3-4, we see God commanding the Israelites not to marry other nations, other nationalities. This is not because God is a racist. This is simply because God did not want the other religions to come in and take over that God. So he wanted to keep the Hebrews pure, but not from racial or any other ethnic group, merely pure in the sense of Judaism and the Jews serving God and God alone. So if you look at 1 Kings 11:4-8, we actually see kind of an example of what happens in this disobedience. Again, this is not because of race and race being wrong. It's merely because God commanded them not to take people from other religions. And unfortunately, in 1 Kings 11:4-8, King Solomon actually did. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. So because of his disobedience in, first of all, taking more than one wife, and second of all, taking wives of different religions, he fell astray and he disobeyed. If we look at Romans 10:12, we'll see evidence of what God thinks of different races and intercultural marriages. Romans 10:12 talks about how in Christ, if one is a believer, there's no longer Jew or Greek or Gentile or anything else. It's merely just Christians. And that's the important thing to remember here is intercultural marriage is biblical so long as both people are serving the Lord, and that's it. It does not depend on race. It does not depend on which country someone came from or how they grew up. If one person in one side of the relationship and one person on the other side of the relationship are both serving the Lord, then the Bible is completely lined up and accepting of that. So let's talk about some possible conflicts. So based on some of my research, here's a quote that I really liked from one of my research books. Those living in multicultural settings or those of a mixed culture heritage will experience some instability, conflict, and great subjectivity of cultural identity than persons of a single ethnic heritage. This can align for children and for people going into a marriage covenant in an intercultural setting. There's always going to be different ways of communication. There's always going to be different backgrounds and beliefs. And that can cause problems, especially if it's not communicated properly and those expectations aren't clear. For example, someone may have a different way of raising or disciplining their child. Someone may have a different way of saving money, or their outlook on money may be different. And that's really important to realize going into an intercultural marriage or relationship as a whole. It's also important to remember that this impacts not just the two people involved, but their families, any possible children that they would have, and the community, because they all have to, I don't want to say have to as if it's a bad thing, but they all have the opportunity to then interact with a different culture in itself. So what the problems are caused when differences are not acknowledged and dealt with properly, and then the marriage unit faces a really unique strain which can cause resentment instead of community, and obviously resentment within a marriage is not ideal. Let's talk about some positives, though, stemming from intercultural marriage. So for me, the biggest one that stood out, and I talk about a lot in my paper, is that in an intercultural marriage, both sides are forced to challenge their ethnocentrism and evaluate their life differently. So one may quickly realize that certain behaviors in their own culture are narrow-minded and or unbiblical, and then being exposed to a different culture so personally helps to overcome these flaws. And together, a couple may create a family culture which is altogether better and healthier than the two separate ones could have ever been. Like I was saying, with the cons, a pro also is that not just the two people are affected by this. The family, the community, the children also see that, and they get a better outlook on than just having, as opposed to just having one worldview. Alright, so these are my sources that I used in this paper. I really feel like I learned a lot from it, and that I really kind of grew from researching this different stuff and not just taking it of like what I've known in the past. And so I really appreciated this project. That is all. Thank you for watching. That was a mess. But you know what?